you doing? I'm Ken Bykoff, and welcome to O'Neill Speaks, the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. In May 2023, the United States Supreme Court handed down a ruling that limited the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to protect millions of acres of wetlands from pollution by saying that the EPA could not regulate discharges into wetlands unless they have a continuous surface connection to larger bodies of water. Then, just a few weeks ago, the Indiana State House passed and Governor Eric Holcomb signed House Enrolled Act 1383, which redefines some protected wetlands, limiting their protection. Indiana's wetlands are grouped into three tiers by the state. Class 3 wetlands, the highest tier, receive full protections. Class 2 wetlands have fewer protections and Class 1 has none. Those standards were put in place in 2022, and the latest law will redefine select Class 3 wetlands as Class 2. Now, wetlands are often overlooked by the general public, but they play a crucial role in nature. Wetlands, or aquatic environments that are covered by freshwater, saltwater, or a mix, are the planet's natural wastewater treatment facilities and carbon-storing champions. They soak up excess nutrients in soil, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which are normally found in fertilizer and can leach from farmland, and wetlands also catch and hold excess stormwater, reducing flooding on that landscape. Now, developers are lauding the latest bill as a boon to construction, but environmental advocates are angry about the loss of protections. To learn more about this issue, we're thrilled to welcome Janet Dewey Professor of Rural Land Policy, Christopher Kraft. Professor Kraft is a professional wetland scientist and has studied the effects of climate change, eutrophication, and other human activities on eutrine and freshwater wetlands and the restoration of those ecosystems. In 2012, he received the National Wetlands Award for Science Research. Kraft has been a visiting professor with senior international scientists of the Chinese Academy of Sciences since 2010. Professor Kraft, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ken, for having me on today, and I'm pretty happy to talk about wetlands with you.
Well, first off, explain to everybody why wetlands are so important.
Well, Ken, in your introduction, you kind of hit on many of them. I would say we sort of group them into four functions that they provide: hydrologic functions related to water, water quality improvement, which you talked about, habitat, and then biodiversity, which is something harder to put a dollar value on. But certainly the hydrologic functions and the water quality functions, we can put a dollar value on those. You know, wetlands are low spots on the landscape. They hold water during times of flooding. This reduces flooding downstream. And during drought or dry periods, they actually help recharge groundwater. And these isolated wetlands that we're really going to talk about today are ones that are very important in doing that. From a water quality perspective, again, low spots are uniquely positioned on the landscape to trap sediment and remove pollutants. And there's been a lot of work with wetland restoration in the Midwest to try to intercept things like nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer that contribute to eutrophication or nutrient over-enrichment in our streams and waterways, but also in the Gulf of Mexico. The other two functions, it's harder to put a dollar value on these, but that doesn't mean they're not important. And so habitat functions are really important. A lot of these depressional wetlands, these isolated wetlands that we talk about, are important migratory stopovers for waterfowl, ducks. And Ducks Unlimited has done an enormous amount of work. They probably do more wetland restoration. And it's not just for duck habitat, but it's for some of these other benefits that I talked about. And then the last one is biodiversity. And that's something that you know it when you see it, but it is hard to put a dollar value on that. But I think anybody who sees wildflowers in bloom or unique plants and animals have a great appreciation for that. And Indiana's got some of these unique systems more in the northern part of the state, but you know, kettle bogs, fens, these may still remain protected under the current law, but that might be another question for me.
What role do wetlands play in combating climate change?
Well, everybody talks about carbon. They do sequester carbon, and on a per area basis, per square foot, per hectare, whatever units you want to use, they store more carbon in soil than any other kind of ecosystem. Different wetlands store different amounts of carbon. The thing that I think is overlooked and probably more important than carbon sequestration is their ability to, we're going to have more frequent rains, we're going to have more droughts and floods, and intensity of rain is going to be greater, and these low spots on the landscape can help soak up some of that excess water and reduce flooding in a future of a warmer and more variable climate.
I know that you're a wetlands scientist, a world-renowned expert in wetlands, but could you try to explain to me kind of what the argument is made for why these protections maybe should be limited?
Well, I saw the bill when it came out, and I read it, and I read some of the rationale for doing that. And as you said earlier, what they're doing is they're taking some of the Class 3 wetlands, which are the highest quality ones in the state, and they're moving them to Class 2. And so we're getting rid of some of the best ones, which is, or we're increasing exemptions for them. One argument that the business community made is that, and they used the word soaring home prices. And I really think that kind of statement is disingenuous at best, and it's dishonest at worst. Wetlands are not responsible for the high house prices. Let's blame it on supply chain issues, the higher cost of everything that's occurring today. We're trying to buy a house now, and it's twice as expensive as it was in 2020 or pre-pandemic, and it certainly isn't because the wetlands are being overly protected in Indiana. That's my opinion.
Well, wetlands are nowhere near where I live, and I know the value of my home has almost doubled in the 15 years that I've been there, and that has nothing to do with wetlands.
Right.
How you mentioned reading the bill to begin with. You read a bill like that. How furious are you that when you read that kind of thing?
Well, Ken, at my age, I feel like society in general, every time you pick up the paper, somebody's outraged over something, and I just feel like these adjectives are being overused. I'm getting close to retirement, as I told you, and I want to enjoy what the world has to offer in the remaining years. But I think using these words like outraged and mad and this and that, let's try to be proactive and do something positive instead of complaining about it. Sure. But as you know, the media, maybe not you, they make a mountain out of every molehill.
Well, what's kind of the best way then to find a balance between serving the needs of citizens and also protecting the critical environmental areas?
This is probably the toughest question that you're going to ask, and it's certainly the hardest one for me to answer. And I think if we talk about, wetlands overall, the Supreme Court ruling trumps everything. Although states can take an extra step and protect wetlands that the Supreme Court doesn't. And some states do that. And Indiana's isolated wetlands bill did that. That bill got passed in 2005. And it was really proactive and really forward thinking. But in my 20-something years here at Indiana University, they rolled back protections for them about 2 years ago. Maybe 3, it was in 2020. And now they're doing that now. It's an erosion of the protection of wetlands. It's not wholesale taking them off the landscape. The Supreme Court says like floodplains and coastal wetlands are going to be protected at the federal level. As you mentioned in your introduction, you need to have a continuous line of water coming across your site, your wetland, at some time of the year that connects the true aquatic system like a lake or a stream. And those are federally protected by the Clean Water Act, and it's pretty straightforward. Wetlands, are in this kind of gray area. And these isolated wetlands, of course, they don't have that continuous surface water connection every year. So they're in the gray area, and the Supreme Court said, well, we're not going to protect those right now. The Indiana isolated wetlands law does protect some of those, but I hate to see this erosion of the protections. It's sort of slow burn, I guess I would say. Everybody says this. We need to get more public engagement. We need to do more education. And I've been doing that for a long time, and I sometimes wonder how effective it is, to be honest. But that doesn't mean you don't keep trying.
Where was one find these isolated wetlands? Where do they tend to exist?
Of course, flat landscapes. Northern half of the state's pretty flat. They're not adjacent to a stream or a ditch or a lake, so they're spatially isolated. They receive most of their water from rainfall. There's some here in the southern part of the state. We would call them vernal pools. And one important function of these, and it depends on if you like biodiversity and herpetofauna, salamanders and frogs and toads, but these are breeding grounds for these salamanders, frogs, and toads. These areas are wet in the winter and the spring. These vertebrates migrate to the site. They lay their eggs in these depressions. One thing is, since they dry out during the year, they don't typically have fish populations. And the fish, if they were there, would eat the tadpoles and the eggs. So these are really important breeding grounds. The salamanders and the frogs and toads go back to the uplands and spend their life. But they need these wet areas, especially these isolated depressional areas, to reproduce. We've done work in the past on isolated wetlands in agricultural landscapes, and they definitely remove pollutants. There's no doubt about it. They're trapping sediment. They're removing nitrogen and phosphorus, and nitrate in particular is an important compound or element to remove because it's soluble and it dissolves in water, and it gets into the groundwater. And well, that's a public health hazard right there. So these depressional wetlands can denitrify that nitrate and keep it from going up into groundwater. All wetlands do that, but these isolated wetlands, very important. States like Iowa have a groundwater nitrate problem because there's so much coming off the farm fields. And of course, they don't have a lot. They've drained most of their wetlands, just like most of the agricultural Midwest has.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about. That you mentioned the farmlands. It seems that having this kind of area, adjacent to a farm would be a huge positive.
There's a lot of interest, and it's money by U.S. Department of Agriculture to build or restore wetlands downstream of agricultural fields. And a lot of this work has been done in Iowa, where they'll take the tile drain water, so the fields are drained by these underground tiles, and that pipe goes out to the stream and empties into it. And you could construct or build a wetland down there, hold that water for a little while, days, to remove that nitrate, and then release that cleaner water into the streams and the creeks that are downstream.
Can wetlands be built to kind of offset those that have been lost?
Legally, they're required to replace these wetlands that are lost. We call it wetland mitigation. You got to mitigate for the damage you cause by draining this wetland. And there's been a lot of money spent on that, and it doesn't work that well. I mean, the mitigation has been around for 30-something years, and the problems are typically there's money to restore or build the wetland, and then whoever did it just walks away. There's no monitoring to see if it continues to work. Usually it gets taken over by invasive species. And I've worked with small landowners here in southern Indiana, and I've also worked with Indiana University. And we've had this problem. And there's just really, and IDEM, they enforce what they can, but I really don't think they have the people power to go out and look at all these different sites. I know that Indiana University, I worked with a restoration effort with them around the education building almost 15 years ago, and it has never been released by IDEM as a functioning system. And about every 3 years, IU gets a letter from IDEM telling them that they're not in compliance, but it just seems like nothing happens. And I'll say this, if the big boys like Indiana University that have relatively deep pockets are not able or willing to do good wetland mitigation on their projects, how can you expect a small landowner who maybe has 25 acres or something to do that? And I do think on these small landowners, there's sometimes an onus because of all the paperwork and that sort of thing.
Sure.
That's what I hear, and I don't disagree with them.
Yeah.
So
where do environmental advocates kind of go from here to try to extend or protect the current protections?
Well, it seems that lobbying is not that effective, has not been that effective. I will say, Indiana doesn't have a lot of wetlands anymore. 88% roughly have been drained and converted. The northern part of the state had enormous acreage of wetlands 170 years ago. It's a place called Beaver Lake. It's not a lake. There's no lake there anymore. But I think other states that have a lot of aquatic resources, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, they're more upper Midwest, but they're in this part of the world, they have more stringent laws to protect them because people recognize the value. They see these things and they use these things, and they see the value in keeping them. It's hard. Public education is important. One thing I would make a plug for is, and this is probably going to be the most effective way to protect wetlands, is work with Land Trust, Nature Conservancy. They have a 5,000-acre property in northwest Indiana called Kankakee Sands, and it was agricultural land. I think it was marginal, though. It still was wet even with drainage. But they bought up the 5,000 acres 25 or 30 years ago, and they're restoring this mosaic of prairie and wetland habitat because they were interspersed with each other. And there's oak savannas in there, too. And these are valuable. The Nature Conservancy's main interest is biodiversity. But they've reintroduced bison up there. If you ever get the chance, it's off of I-65 on the way to Chicago. It's about 40 miles north of Lafayette, near the town of Morocco, Indiana. Locally or regionally, the Sycamore Land Trust. They're more of a regional land trust, but join those organizations and give them money, and they will acquire land. So we're asking sort of the private sector and the NGOs to do, and maybe what the state and the government agencies aren't able or willing to do. So I'm a big advocate of both of those organizations. There's a place here in Monroe County called Bean Blossom Bottoms, and it's owned by the Sycamore Land Trust. And Duke Energy has supported it through the years. There's like a 2-mile elevated boardwalk that goes through there, and it makes a loop. And you'll see a nice mature bottomland hardwood forest that you don't see much of anymore. And there was old fields when they acquired the land, but they flooded it, and now it's turning into marsh habitat. And it's probably a 25-minute drive from the campus. And when I teach my class, we use that as a teaching tool all the time. Lake Monroe's got some good sites too.
I've been hiking out at that site, and it is gorgeous, and it is unique for anybody that likes hiking, because like you said, they have raised boardwalk that then goes into a forest that has another boardwalk that goes through, and also it's a really learning experience because they try to explain, this is the restoration that we're trying to do. And there's unfortunately some interesting things to see because of a tornado that went through there, that you have some trees that were brought down. They're still there.
That was probably 5 to 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. So that site, though, there's beavers out there, and of course they're killing the forest because they're flooding it. But that creates an aquatic habitat, a lake. You're seeing ducks out there. You're seeing raptors. I don't know if I've seen a bald eagle, but it wouldn't surprise me to see one of those. I highly recommend that site.
So this is an impossible question for you to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do you just get more people engaged with like the issue of wetlands and understand why it is important to protect them? Well,
that's an easy question to answer, but in today's world, it's getting harder and harder. I grew up with appreciation for the outdoors. The Boy Scouts gets a bad name now, but we went camping every month, and it gave me a great appreciation, and I still continue that. You need to get people interested in nature and one way to get them interested is to get them out in nature. Birders, we should be teaming up not only with Ducks Unlimited, but with like the Audubon Society, because a lot of charismatic birds, there's the place over in Greene County that's escaping me, the name of it, that's a huge birding stopover now. I should remember the name of that place. But unfortunately, I feel like more and more people are looking at their screens. I'm getting ready to retire. I'm old school. Today's generation, they probably spend more time looking at their screens than they're outside looking at the wonders of nature and sunrises and sunsets. There'll always be an element of the small part of the population of people like me who do this, but I feel like increasingly we're as a society we're losing our connection to nature. I'm not sure how to fix that.
And I'm a big advocate.
Nature boot camp.
Big advocate for hiking and getting out in nature myself, and there's certainly so many great resources for that in the state.
There are.
Well, Chris, I appreciate you taking so much time for joining us, and I thank you for all the years of research in this critical area.
Thank you, Ken, and you all have a great spring.
Well, that's all the time we have today on O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks is the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All opinions and comments on O'Neill Speaks belong to the host and the guest of the O'Neill School and don't necessarily reflect those of the school itself. Music for O'Neill Speaks is by Manos Mars. Be sure to subscribe to O'Neill Speaks on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher app so you don't miss an episode. We're out of time, but for now, and for the O'Neill School, I'm Ken Bykoff saying thanks for listening, everybody.